Ladies and gentlemen, an extended Louis Free radio show, Brain Food from the Heartland. I am so excited to have Dr. Stephen Buchmann on about his new book, What a Bee Knows, Exploring the Thoughts, Memories, and Personality of Bees. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be on your show.
I'm delighted. I'm honored to have you. A little bit about your background, if you would.
Sure. I guess I've been a bee hugger since high school.
Love that.
Yeah, and kept honeybee colonies. I had one
Stephen.
interesting initial experience when I tried to get some honey out of a feral colony in an old shed, and I learned a number of things that day. You don't work honeybees on a cold, drizzly day. You don't have a veil with some leaks, and you don't wear black socks.
You learned the hard way.
Yeah, so I probably had about 100 or 200 stings, but even,
Oh, wow.
even though I spent 22 years of my career in the a USDA laboratory, the Carl Hayden Bee Research Center here in Tucson, one of the biggest honeybee labs in the country. My first love are really the unsung heroines of pollination and flower visits. So I really like to work with many of the other 21,000 species of bees that we have around the world, almost 4,000 in the US. And so these are bees that most people might think they are wasps. They make their nests in the ground, little tunnels in the ground, or they might live in cavities in trees or in broken twigs. So I like to do research on those native bees that we really don't hear a lot about.
Your interest, again, you had the experience, you were interested when you were young and pursued this, the love of nature. I mean, I've read a bit about you and how you feel, and I love how you write about the experiences that you still have today with seeing flowers and bees, et cetera. Where'd that passion, where do you think how did that develop?
Um, I was certainly encouraged by my parents, and when we would take various road trips through the Southwest, we would stop in national parks, and I was quite interested in all insects, but especially bees. I remember in high school and early college, I would travel with my friends from Southern California over into Arizona, like into Madera Canyon and those areas, and we would, in our campground, hang a sheet and put up a black light, and we would just be entranced by what would come in: giant lacewings, colorful metallic scarab beetles, and so yeah, I did some bee observation, and then I quickly went into studying the different behaviors that bees exhibit, either when they're nesting, trying to find a mate, or when they're visiting and pollinating flowers. And I still do that to this day.
And still get a lot of joy out of it
Oh, yeah.
from in reading your passion. I love your passion and your new book, of course, What a Bee Knows, Exploring the Thoughts, Memories, and Personality of Bees. We've got links up for it. You can go to Island Press. You can find it everywhere. And I just think that's great. A lot of your books, you've been writing for decades about bees.
Yeah, my first book actually was with my good friend Gary Paul Nabhan, who's an ethnobotanist and MacArthur Genius Award winner, and we wrote our first book together called The Forgotten Pollinators in 1996, actually through the same publisher, Island Press in Washington, D.C. And
Wonderful.
yeah, in that book, it was coming together and thinking about after we had traveled around the world studying insects and plants, and we had both started to notice that, hey, we're seeing a lot fewer pollinators than we used to. And so that book was kind of a uh, call to arms, basically, to let people know that there's probably a pollinator decline right around the corner. And from that experience, we started a forgotten pollinators and migratory pollinators campaign, the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum. And that was picked up by the Brazilian government, by the Europeans. And so that book sort of kickstarted a lot of international pollinator conservation campaigns around the world. And I'm really, really proud and of that and happy that happened.
In writing this book, the overused phrase with respect to Malcolm Gladwell, your tipping point to write What a Bee Knows, what was, or inspiration, I should say it, with all the books you've written.
I actually wanted to step out of my comfort zone a little bit. I consider myself a pollination ecologist. I also study insect behavior, especially bee nesting biology and mating strategies. But I thought, hey, a book that could try to get the reader inside the head of a bee, as possible as that is. And so, first thing I do is I talk about the sensory physiology of bees, how they see, how they hear, how they smell and taste, and how those things are similar to our own sensibilities, but also totally alien to a lot of those sensory capabilities. And then beyond that, I wanted to tell some exciting stories of especially colleagues of mine like Lars Chitka in England, who last year wrote a book, The Mind of a Bee, and wanted to tell about how bees learn, how they think, how they problem solve, and get into some of the bigger questions about, are bees self-aware, those sorts of things.
Again, I do want to say you're extremely bright. And I want my audience to know that this is a very readable book. You're able to make it accessible for the average reader, which I absolutely love. I enjoy some books sometimes, but I'm always looking things up that are more meant for people with higher level of education than I. Yet I love the book. I love how it flowed also. When you write about in the book, and again, folks, that book is What a Bee Knows, Exploring the Thoughts, Memories, and Personalities of Bees. I started to see some of the things about a bee's life. And forgive me, I'm going to read a line or two of your book to you, with you,
Sure.
not with you too. It's difficult and busy life. Her brain, though no larger than a poppy seed, can handle the complex thoughts and challenging celestial and landmark navigation that daily foraging requires. When I read that, we just don't think about that. Bees do this, they pollinate, most of us. And then to think about what goes on in that poppy seed sized brain just blew my mind.
Yeah, thanks. It's like it's a formidable task for them to, especially for ground nesting bees, to leave their nest. When they do, they go through this sort of zigzagging. And what they're doing is memorizing the landmarks around their nest so they can find their way back home. But they also do it in terms of they use a celestial compass, a sun compass, so they can know where the sun is in the sky. They can actually read and interpret patterns of polarized light in the sky that we cannot see. So, think of it in terms of, you're going to the grocery store, but the grocery store is 1,000 miles away. And, in terms of the bee size relative to our size, and they have to go out there. Female bees are collecting pollen and nectar, the nectar to feed themselves, the pollen to feed to their brood, and they have to bring the groceries back home, and it's not an easy thing.
And they do it every day.
They do it, dozens or hundreds of times a day. Well, dozens of times a day.
It's amazing when you learned about and write about where bees came from. Stephen, tell us a little bit about that. I mean, you
Sure.
go all the way back.
Yeah. I mean, we have to go back to the Cretaceous when there were dinosaurs walking the earth. And so the best we know is that bees evolved from wasps about 130 million years ago. And flowering plants, the 350,000 or so species of flowering plants that we have around the world, only predated them by about 10 million years. And with the explosion of bees and other pollinators, that really helped catapult the adaptive radiation of flowers. And that's why we have so many flowers today. And yet, before about the year 1793, when Christian Conrad Sprengel started looking and thinking about flowers, most people thought that flowers were here just for us, to beautify the earth for us, but really they're living billboards, signposts to bees and other pollinators to allow them to find the flowers.
It's just it's amazing. I'm getting emails, and I know I was going to ask you down the road a little bit, but I want to make sure for people that may or may not be able to listen to the entire interview. How concerned are you for the future of bees?
Yeah, I'm quite concerned. There, as I said, there's about 3,500, well, almost 4,000 species in the U.S., about 21,000 around the world. Fortunately, there's a lot of redundancy built into Mother Nature, so that each flowering plant, whether it's a wildflower or a crop plant, might have on the order of, say, a half a dozen or maybe even a dozen floral visitors. And those could be bees, flies, wasps, beetles, butterflies, moths, even nectar bats, and hey, there's even a lizard pollinator on some islands off the coast of New Zealand.
Oh,
So there's some bizarre pollinators out there. So if we only had one species, if we only had the champion pollinator of agriculture, honeybees, of which we only have, depending who's counting, 10 or 11 species around the world, and really only one or two of them are major pollinators that beekeepers can move around and bring to different crops. And certainly honeybees have problems with two kinds of mites, small hive beetle, various bacterial and viral diseases, as well as an onslaught of insecticides like neonicotinoids and other insecticides. Fortunately, we do have those other native bees that can take up the slack and serve as surrogates. In fact, a lot of those native bees are better pollinators than honeybees. One thing that I've spent most of my research career on is something called buzz pollination. And flowers like blueberries, cranberries, kiwi fruit, eggplant, tomatoes, those sorts of things have flowers that have anthers that are hollow, and they release their pollen through one or two little holes in the tips of the anthers. And even if you turn those, think of them as the fingers on my hand with those little holes, even if you turn that flower cone upside down, the flower doesn't come out. The only way it can come out is when a bee like a bumblebee or a carpenter bee, the female bites the anther and she literally turns herself into a tuning fork. And the same sort of musical frequencies that we know about, between about 100 to 500 cycles per second. Let's see, what would A be? About 440 cycles per second. So those frequencies blast the pollen out. And I called that buzz pollination. So that really allows us to have really tasty foods like tomatoes, blueberries, and cranberries. And for whatever reason, honeybees cannot buzz pollinate. They just don't do it. But bumblebees, carpenter bees, Anthophora, lots of other bees can. But I digressed a little bit from your initial.
please, no, it's good. It's interesting.
The worry I have is that like, for example, bumblebees. We have 250 species of bumblebees around the world. They're most diverse in China, but we have 50 kinds here in the US. At least 5 of them are in really dire straits due to insecticides and something my colleagues have called pathogen spillover. So, what seems to have happened is that companies offering bumblebees for sale to pollinate tomatoes and other crops went to Florida. They collected certain queens of bumblebees. They brought them to European insectaries, and there they became cross-contaminated with uh, protozoan parasites like Crithidia bombi and others. And then they came back. They didn't know they were infected. They went into the greenhouses. Those greenhouses are not bee-proof. There are louvers in the ceiling for, temperature regulation. Tomatoes have no nectar, so the bees like to fly out of the greenhouse. So those contaminated, infected bees, if you will, landed on flowers outside the greenhouse, and they transferred those um, protozoan parasites to our native bees. So that sort of thing is really impacting honeybees. Impacting bumblebees. And in fact, one bumblebee, Franklin's bumblebee, that lived in Washington State and California, we now believe is the first bumblebee to go extinct because it hasn't been seen since about 2006. So that's my worry, that we, through global commerce, have spread these pathogens around. And, I wish here in the United States we would ban things like neonicotinoid insecticides, which are really hell for bees, and go with insecticides that are much safer. Or, you know, let's say you're a home gardener. You shouldn't really be using insecticides, in my opinion. There are other ways to do it. But if you have to use them, you can do simple things like spraying at night when bees aren't active. So anyway, that's kind of my take on the situation, although I know there are some people that certainly don't agree with me on that.
Well, I often been concerned about the overuse as a layman. The overuse of that's a go-to thing. We'll just we'll kill them. We'll kill I just that is just horrific. When and being the pollinators, if you don't care about the bees, I'm going to say on an emotional level, a living creature, you ought to be concerned about your food.
Yeah,
And
it's a third of our global diet.
I just that which absolutely freaks me out when I think when I've read, and obviously you're the expert, not me, but when they have to truck in bees to pollinate areas, farmers and that, and it's just where'd the bees go? And I asked people. So I had a neighbor last year. I said, "Are you seeing bees?" She said, "I've seen some in the backyard. I used to see bees all the time." And again, that's frightening to me. And I want people to know that in the appendix of the book, in that book, What a Bee Knows, they have what we can do to help pollinators and their plants, which I love that. I love that. It gives people specific tips and things to do to help. We can all help, correct?
Right. We can do small things, but it all adds up. Oh, one thing I was going to mention, coming out of I'm now working with some other colleagues at University of California and Cornell, and we are investigating what helpful sort of mutualistic bacteria and fungi are in the bellies of bees, basically adult bees, and also occur in their food, the so-called bee bread, the mixture of pollen and nectar that's in their brood cells. And if you ask most beekeepers or most farmers about herbicides, they'll say, "Oh, herbicides are safe for bees. They only kill weeds." Well, I have two comments. First, killing the weeds, in quotes, you're knocking out some bee food. So even, for example, dandelions or other weedy plants are providing nectar and pollen for certain bees. Secondly, in our research, what we've just found is, okay, it is true that herbicides do not have a big LD50. They're not very toxic for adult bees, but that's not true for the larval bees, basically the developing, the baby bees in the cells underground. So what we found is that these herbicides, which were thought to be innocuous, are killing the helpful bacteria and yeasts in the food that the larval bees are eating. So then it either makes them sick or kills them outright. So here's another example of, well, our agrochemicals that we thought were perfectly safe, when we really investigate it, they're not so safe.
And I love the book, What a Bee Knows. And I do want to say we're talking about some horrific things that are happening. The book tells you how amazing a bee is. Again, there's a lot of information about the other things, but I don't want to lose track of people. I don't want people to know that this is a really informative book. Is it, again, my opinion, is it scary? Is it scary for people to read? No, it's informative. People need to know. And the more, I believe, the more you know about the bee, be it the fact that obviously the importance of pollinators, the more you understand how amazing they are. I had no idea. I had no idea. I'll go back, Stephen, about when we were talking about the brain. It was just the bee's brain and what they do and how they do it. It's fascinating. I was going to say, who knew? You knew. Now you shared it with all of us.
Yeah, I mean, it's the bee's brain is not really my forte. I'm not a card-carrying neurobiologist, but I do have colleagues that are. And what I've tried to talk about are some of the behavioral things where bees are solving everyday problems as they forage, as they fly out into the world to visit flowers or make their way back home. And yeah, try to throw out some interesting things that that shock or and fascinate me. One of my favorites were some experiments where bumblebees were tested in the lab, and bumblebees come in sort of small, medium, and large sizes. Basically, no insect grows after they're an adult. So the size of the adult insect or bee is dependent on how much they ate as a kid, as a larva. And so you had these fat bees flying toward a little barrier, a little slit that they had to go through to get some food. And the fat bees would basically turn themselves sideways and go through. So they knew their body dimensions, and so they had this idea of their size. So I say they're self-aware.
Self-aware, yeah. Which makes sense. Got to know. You got to know that to be able to do that. Like humans, if you're squeezing through something, you got to turn sideways. I just, that's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating to me. When I love talking about bumblebees in the book, learning to play soccer, etc., which I think was great. By the way, are there natural things people can use to keep bees away from the garden, or because I fear people using any chemical or
Yeah. When I was with the USDA laboratory in Tucson, we tested many hundreds of compounds as sort of a bee repellent, and nothing we ever tried worked. I mean, people in Tucson and other places that have set out hummingbird feeders, sometimes these get mobbed by honeybees, and they'll ask me, what can I do? And I basically say, well, in the case of the hummingbird feeder, take it down for about a week, and the bees will forget that it's there, and they'll have to relearn it. So
that's great.
that's about the only thing. But yeah, I wish there was some magic bullet solution kind of repellent that we could use in certain cases. to keep bees safe. But
Keep them safe. Keep
yeah,
them away, but safe, but not hurt them.
right.
That would be great. It just made me think of, I use I, some a oh god spray to keep bugs because of ticks, and I hike in the park a lot, and somebody close to me was like, "Oh, what about ticks?" So I use this natural. It's certain, I don't know, oils, um, fragrant oils that supposedly keep the ticks away. I haven't been bitten by one. I wasn't either before using it. I hope someone can develop something like that to keep the bees safe. It, of course, keeps our food supply. That's the wake up call, I think, for people.
Oh yeah.
The wake up call that this is our food, and without pollinators, and I know butterflies, etc., other pollinators, there's no food.
No.
And you explain that well about how that happens.
Yeah, I like to, in talks that I give, I like to also mention it's not just pollination and about a third of our global diet worth hundreds of billions of dollars, but um, bees perform a lot of what we call ecosystem services. So, for example, because the vast majority of bees are solitary, but they nest in the ground, they dig tunnels. And so to create their brood cells, like their nurseries for the young bees below ground, those tunnels cause air and water to infiltrate the soil. This is called the bioturbation, which is just a fancy name for digging in the dirt, basically. And another thing that happens is that when those larval bees, which are fed pollen, finish feeding on it, they defecate, and the bee poop is basically pollen and nitrogen rich, and that stays below ground. So just like earthworms and other things like that, bees of all kinds that nest in the ground are enriching the soil. So they're fertilizing the soil. So those are some of the other things that we don't typically think about bees. Also, bees as part of ecosystems, bees themselves are food for spiders and birds and lizards and various rodents. So they're part of these really uh, interwoven food webs that makes the world work, basically.
It's amazing. It's amazing how interconnected we all are. With glyphosate, we talk about glyphosate in bees.
Roundup.
Yeah.
Um, there that one of the issues is that in modern agriculture or even in nurseries, the point I like to make is that you have to be cautious because so many of these chemicals have been designed to be systemic. So, in other words, they're taken up by the plant, so they contaminate every part of the plant. Um, if you buy plants from certain nurseries, especially huge national chain nurseries, sometimes there are slow release insecticides in the pot, just like the little round beads of Osmocote, which are slow release fertilizer. Well, there are also slow release poisons that get taken up by the plant. These don't just go into the leaves that might poison a caterpillar or something. These are going into the nectar and pollen for bees and wasps and other insects. So uh, you do have to be careful. I also recommend that people, if they're planting, probably the single most important thing you can do to help pollinators is to plant flowers around your house
Beautiful.
or your garden, and to try to have a diverse uh, cornucopia of flowers in different seasons: spring, summer, fall. And these should be native plants, preferably ones that are uh, adapted to your local climate and soil types, that sort of thing. And you'll end up with happier pollinators, and you'll be spending less money. you can spend a fortune by going to nurseries and buying plants, especially hybrids, bringing them home. And people don't think about it. A lot of those hybrid plants have been bred not maliciously by plant breeders, but bred for human sensibilities. So to please us.
I see.
And a lot of things have been bred out of them. I mean, when was the last time you smelled a nice fragrant rose? They practically don't exist. So if you have a hybrid plant, the pollinators can show up, and here's this roughly quadrupled petal flower that looks great, but maybe doesn't smell great, and may even have little or no pollen or nectar. So the danger with a lot of these hybrid plants that we've created is that they're not as nutritious for bees as native plants, or maybe an heirloom variety that your grandmother might have planted in her garden.
That's interesting, and people need to do their research on that. I'm talking with the author of What a Bee Knows, exploring the thoughts, memories, and personalities of bees. The book available everywhere online. It's Island Press book, and I encourage you to get it and read it. The author is our guest, Dr. Stephen Buchmann. When we were mentioning about, and I don't want to go on and on about the glyphosate. I don't understand how it's even legal. You're always seeing about for humans, it's toxic for humans and all the cancers that developed. And it was concerned me when they did the Roundup Ready soybeans, the genetically modified soy. And I've always wondered, well, isn't that soybean carrying the glyphosate? It won't kill it. It boggles.
It definitely, gets into the nectar and poisons that. There was a case a number of years ago where corn, and I don't know whether it was, I'm blanking out, I can't remember what it was, glyphosate or something else, but corn pollen actually was toxic, and it was falling on milkweed plants that were near the cornfields. And so monarch butterfly caterpillars were eating it and dying. So that's just one other weird example of where we think something's totally safe, but really it's not.
Yeah. And I want to go on my whole, I've got I'll have to send it to you, a Monsanto song. It was, food, and I'm going to send it to you. It's interesting about, I don't want to go off too much on the glyphosate. But I do want to say also that I don't know how it's legal, and I don't know how, even if somebody a farmer knew how to use it, was trained in how to use it. I see it, people buying gallons of it that don't. And and I had read an interesting article, Dr. Buckman, a few years ago in a publication called Farm and Dairy that's published not far from where I live. And they talked about, it's for the industry, but I was interested in it. And they talked about pesticide drift, that if you're using these, you have to be aware that it will drift into your neighbors. It doesn't just stay there. And there's, again, a multitude of the water supply, et cetera. I'm sorry, I just go off on that. We're killing ourselves. You write about, and I love this, you write about what you can do to help. Be mindful about bees. Tell us about that. I mean, we're talking a little bit about it, but be mindful.
Yeah, again, I guess because of my shifting feelings about them. I mean, as a graduate student in the late 1970s, I was involved with collecting bees for museums as part of taxonomic studies. And I collected a lot of bees, and these are now on pins in various major museums around the country. And they're important scientific resources, but over the years, and especially in the last decade, I will now only collect a specimen as a voucher when it's absolutely necessary. It's difficult. In fact, it's almost impossible to identify a bee to species unless you have it in your hand, either alive or dead, looking at it under a microscope. But I just became aware of some of the harm that I was doing, and I'll capture a bee in the house in a little jar or vial or something and release it.
Yeah.
My neighbors think I'm crazy.
My neighbors think I'm crazy. I do the same thing.
But, and I will get behind my camera, and people can use cell phones or cameras. They're so great now with macro lenses, and just would encourage people to get out and just enjoy learning about bees, looking at their diversity. I mean, we have a bee in Arizona that's the smallest bee in the world, 2 millimeters long. We also have giant black carpenter bees. We have metallic green bees. A bee on a flower, I mean, there's such a cultural bias here. When I travel in Asia, people keep crickets in little cages and they love them. In the book, I talk about, the cricket on the hearth in the US is more likely to elicit somebody throws a shoe at it to shut it up. And we're convinced that one bee or wasp or ant sting, well, first of all, that every encounter is going to lead to a sting, and one sting, that one sting is going to kill us. And it's just not true. It could be painful for a while, but very, very few people are allergic enough that they would have to carry like a EpiPen. Yeah. But if you get out there, when bees, female or male bees, are visiting flowers, they're not in attack mode, right? If you go close to a bumblebee nest, or like especially here in Arizona, an Africanized bee nest, you'll soon meet the guard bees and you can get stung. But even with the so-called killer bees, Africanized bees, or any bee on a flower, they're not near their nest then, and they're trying to collect food, nectar and pollen. So you can get up close and personal with them. You could collect them in a little vial and look at them, or you could just observe them or photograph them on flowers.
Make sure you let them go. By the way, if you're
and just in the last few years, there are field guides that are amazing that we can now use that will let you, a little bit of knowledge, learn about these creatures and appreciate them. And there are some recent books by Joe Wilson that I would really advise your listeners to look up. One is called Bees in Your Backyard, and it's just profusely illustrated, and it's just a really, really goldmine of information about our bees, our native bees.
Oh, that's great. And I'm with you about the jar. I mean, be it a fly, be it found a ladybug. Recently, why would I just smash them? And when you can get them out, it's not. I won't belabor it, but I've got my method. I've got the little piece of hard paper that can slip underneath the jar when
exactly.
Open the door. Yeah. And do it. And like you say about your neighbors should say, I'm going to do that. That's a good idea. Or what were you doing? Some people may not have thought about it to try to get them out. They don't want to be in your house. They got in there somehow. Correct?
Exactly. And you've probably noticed this too. So that if something, bee or a wasp, any flying insect, when it gets into your house, where does it go? It typically goes to the lighted window.
Yes.
So they're trying to get out. So they will go up against a window, and that's a good place.
Best place. I'm with you. That's my same. I open a window in the kitchen, to make sure that it's not shaded or anything. Shade everything else out. Turn all the lights out, and hope it goes. Eventually, they do, and that's a much easier place to get them. Although I've developed my techniques for other ways. I love the acknowledgments. Your generosity of heart, Professor, is reading. Again, I read maybe obviously differently than a lot of people I know don't read the acknowledgments, don't read the dedication. It tells me a lot about the author. It gives me a lot of insight into who wrote the book. And again, your generosity of heart with the acknowledgments are beautiful. And I also do like you do the history about how you got into bees and the story that you shared with us earlier, but the acknowledgments are beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
it speaks a lot to your heart. I also want to mention the copious notes. I also learned in my radio days to be skeptical if obviously a nonfiction book does not have notes, something. And the term copious notes, that also tells me a lot. These, I've had to learn along the way.
Yeah, they're for people who, I mean, you can read the book without looking at the little
Sure, acknowledgments.
footnotes and going to the back matter. My publisher actually early on thought I was pretty much overboard with the number of notes, and they wanted me to cut those down, and I said no, I want to keep those in there. So it is for digging deeper.
Yeah.
And like you, when I go to a nonfiction book, I almost immediately flip to the back and see that if there are no notes, I'm pretty suspicious.
Yeah. Well, I learned very honestly in my early radio days, I learned the hard way. I had a guest on, I was very welcoming. And I was asking her about, where did this come from? I was curious. I wasn't aggressive. That's not my style of radio. And she blew over it, and I asked her again. She hung up.
Huh.
So yeah, which was weird, because then I had the sound, the deadline. This was when it was just radio, not all the social media, not all the other platforms. And I learned from that to check. I didn't mean it to. I wasn't being, like I say, aggressive or insulting to her. I tried to reach her afterwards. She wouldn't take my call. I wanted to apologize to her, but I did want to know where that came from. And it made the information of suspect, we'll say. Mm-hmm. That's why I love, I'm going on and on, forgive me, but that's why your notes. I'm glad that Island Press, which is a wonderful, wonderful publisher, that I'd just say, I'm guessing you had most control, but they agreed to publish them with all the notes, because there's so much and in yours, there's so much information in the notes.
Right. Well, I don't want to give your listeners the wrong impression. They certainly are a fantastic environmental press, and they weren't against the notes. They were just a little concerned at first about the breadth of the notes, the number, but
I'm familiar with Island Press, and I also didn't mean to make it sound like it was a battle. It was a suggestion, and I hear that from authors, that the publisher thinks I should take this, thought I should have taken this or whatever. I'm glad, and I'm glad you did it with Island Press and all your books, and people can go to your website, we've got the links up, etc., to learn more. But I would also suggest What a Bee Knows would be a wonderful gift for someone. Wonderful gift for someone. I can't even think of all the words. It's a fascinating and educational read, and you write in a way that's really accessible it's not written for tech people, it's written for everyone. And one other thing I do want to say, Professor, that I think this would be a wonderful book to read with a teenager, to start educating them. Maybe not through the whole book, but I think it would look at you and what you've done, and you just never know who you're going to inspire. And I just think it's so important, and get young people to know also. We need to get folks my age educated about it also. Yet I think to inspire a young person, read it together, read it with them, would be a great idea.
Yeah, thanks. That is a good idea. And I did, in writing the book and going through what seemed at the time endless edits during the pandemic, I wanted to make it an accessible book, and I didn't want to dumb down the science, but I wanted to try to relate it so that somebody who is interested, whether they have a high school education or a college education, I mean, maybe I guess I was trying to aim it at maybe the like an NPR listener, somebody like that.
Yeah.
So to try to reach that audience, and then if somebody wants to dig deeper and go and read the actual, either my papers or papers of my scientific colleagues. They can go to the notes. It's really easy today to do the research. I mean, as much as I love libraries,
Yeah,
you can go to my favorite, and you probably know it. I just go to Google Scholar and I'll put in a few keywords, either the name of the plant or the animal or the author or some little phrase, and spits out dozens or hundreds of articles. So that using something like Google Scholar is really, really a great way to uh, dig in a little deeper.
Yeah, and again, go to the notes and you'll find the information, which I again I appreciate very much. And you did. I know I've said this numerous times, but you did. My opinion, and I'm a voracious reader. I love to read, and I'm a big library. I've got my I love my library T-shirt on. But for something like this to make it accessible, you did a brilliant job with it for people.
Oh, thanks.
In a wonderful way.
And actually, I should say, I just found out today. I knew there was an audio version coming, so there is a. I think it's Audible, but anyway,
I know
there's
a
an
lot of people
audio
yeah.
from Tantor Media. I can't remember what city they're based in, but this will be up on the Amazon website pretty soon. But the
Excellent.
Audible audiobook that somebody could listen to what a bee knows in their car
That's
is going to
great
be
news.
available starting the 28th of this month.
Excellent. I appreciate you sharing that because I know a lot of people that listen when they're driving or listen when they're exercising or listen at home. And that's great to know. That's great to know. Not everybody wants to sit with a book these
Right.
days. However they're learning is fine with me. I still like the physical book. Yet I think
me too. Paper cuts and the smell of ink.
See, I'm with you. I'm with you. I really enjoy this. More importantly, I love the information, the passion for your work. Your passion for your work and how you're able to educate us is brilliant. So I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, I'd like to. Can I relate one last thing?
Oh, please. I've got time. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So one of my favorite things in terms of bee learning and what I consider tool use came out of my colleague's lab in London, Lars Chitka, who wrote his own book, which is quite fascinating, but more for, I would say, a bit more of a scientific audience, called The Mind of a Bee last year. He trained bees to go after little sugar water rewards. And if you picture like a plexiglass cover over some little blue round plastic discs, these had a little well drilled into them, and that had sugar water, which bees are sugar junkies. They love it. But to get to it, there was a string attached to that. So the bees had to literally, and you can watch this on YouTube, the bees had to really carefully and but forcefully and powerfully pull that string, and then they're pulling the whole little sugar sled out from under the cover, and then they get it and drink it. And not only were individual bees doing that, hive-mate bumblebees could just watch one of their sisters, one of their hive-mates do it, and then they knew instantly how to do it. So there was social learning, social facilitation involved, and that just blows me away. So that how smart are bees? Really smart.
Yeah, really smart. I'm looking for that. I see some videos by Lars Chitka, and I'll post them up. I appreciate you sharing that because I'll be eager to watch those and share them with folks. That's when you think about again the bee, the mind of the bee, what a bee knows. I love the title. It's great. I appreciate you very, very much. Your work so important. Thank you. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for the buzz you make in the world. Is that okay? Or is that too silly?
we all like to cop a good buzz.
Yes. Thanks for that. Again, Professor Stephen Buchmann, What a Bee Knows, available everywhere online, exploring the thoughts, memories, and personality of bees. And check it out. We've got the links up. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure.
My pleasure, my honor. Folks, fantastic information. Again, I want to talk just a little bit